Okay, so now we're going to get started with part one. This is going to consist of the setup and an introduction to Unity by explaining all of its core concepts and terminology. So for all things Unity, the best place to start is going to be the Unity website. Now you'll be able to get to the Unity website by going to unity.com or unity3d.com. Unity.com is the new website domain, used to be unity3d.com. Either one will take you to this web page. Now Unity's been around since about 2004, when it was founded in Denmark. They used to make some small games. They were called Over the Edge Entertainment. They were a small company, and they really wanted to be game developers. And they created this one game called Goo Ball, and it was actually pretty terrible as far as games go. But what the developers found was that the tools they had created were excellent. And so that's what became Unity. Now, over time, Unity has grown from being a Mac only tool for building games to a tool that's being used for games and simulation, film, architectural development, and some automotive solutions are actually going to be using it internally as well. Now you can find a great deal of information about all of this stuff on the website by clicking on the various categories for games, automotive, film, and architecture, etc., etc. As well as scrolling through the website, you'll be able to get information about the latest from the company, different things that they are building with it, different games that have come out, different shows that they're hosting, and so forth. But for our purposes, the only thing we really need to do is go ahead and get started. So we can either click on Get Started Here or Get Started Here. They'll both take you to the same place. The first thing that you'll come across is plans and pricing. For our purposes, we are going to be in a hackathon. We're not professional game devs, so we don't really care about the business pricing. We'll go to individual. Now, one thing to note is that there are multiple different license types for Unity, but there's only one real executable. So the only thing we ever really need to do is get Unity to download the latest executable, and we're good to go. We can do that by clicking on Getting Started. And when we do that, we'll get to Unity's screen for downloading the Unity Hub, which is where you do all of your downloads and installs and updates and so forth. And on this screen, two things you'll notice here. There's a first-time user section and a returning user section. For first-time users, one of the things they've provided with this new release of Unity is a way to start with building micro games, getting your first game up and running really quickly, which is our goal as well. But their approach is to give you a game to start with and kind of modify it a little bit, add some functionality to it, and learn that way. Now, while we will be doing some of that, that's not exactly the approach that we're going to be taking. But it's very cool, and if you want to take a look at some of those micro games, you can start here. You can pick a micro game. They have games in the karting space. They have a 2D platformer game. They have a simple first-person shooter game. And from those game templates, you can start making mods to those templates to build an actual game. And then from there, you can share your playable game with your friends and family, etc., etc., etc. These are really small games. They're not really suited for our hackathon, so we're not going to take this approach. What we're going to do is go up here to returning users, and we're going to click Go Here. And then it's going to take us to getting started with Unity Personal. And as I mentioned, if you have a different license, educational license or whatever, we'll get a chance to add that later. But this will give us the executable to download so that we can go ahead and get started. We have to accept the terms so that we download. One of the terms for individual developers is that you're not making more than $100,000, you haven't raised a ton of money, etc., etc., and that fits our use case perfectly. So we would click on accepting of the terms, and then we click on Download Unity Hub. The Unity Hub download will start. It's starting again on my machine. And from here, you will be able to start the Unity Hub application so that we can get cranking with building and installing our first game. So now that you have Unity Hub running on your machine, we need to go ahead and start it because it is going to do the rest of our install process. It handles installing the various versions of Unity, the editor, the game engine, etc. So wherever you have it installed on Windows, it's probably going to be somewhere in your shortcut bar, and the Mac, it's going to be in your applications folder. Wherever you've installed it, go ahead and start the Unity Hub application. And once the Unity Hub application starts, we can kind of go ahead and walk through it a little bit. So here we can see that I have this Unity Hub version 2.2.2. The hub updates on its own. It manages everything by itself. So think of it as a way to keep Unity up to date, kind of like Adobe and its tools for handling the same function. Now here we can see that we have projects. So these are all of the many projects that I've managed to develop over the years for Unity. The next thing up is the Learn tab. In the Learn tab, there are various tutorials and microgame projects that you can install, and so you can walk through those. There are many of these here. Some of them, such as the microgames, are 30-minute projects that you can download, install, play around with, and get started. They'll have their own lessons and tutorials associated with them. Others will take numbers of hours. So this 2D beginner class is 14 hours and 20 minutes to actually run through it, etc., etc. So you click on one of these if you wanted to install it. For example, do tanks. It will give you the information about it. You can click on View Tutorials. It'll show you any tutorials that are associated with it and download those files to your machine so that you can use them. Now what we're most concerned with right now is installs, because when your Unity Hub installed, it most likely didn't install a version of Unity for you because it wouldn't have known which one you wanted. In my case, I do have a version of Unity installed already using version 2019.3, which is the latest release, and we want to get you guys all on that same release version as well. To do that, we'll click Add, and when we click Add, we'll get an Add Unity Version dialog. And it's going to tell you about all of the different official pre-releases, etc. of Unity. Now one thing that you can see here, mine is already grayed out. I've already got Unity version 2019.3 installed, so it's not going to let me reinstall it. I would have to uninstall it to reinstall it if I needed to. But I can install other versions of Unity at the same time as the version that I currently have. So Unity segments itself off so that you can have multiple versions, because many times a project may run across multiple versions of Unity. So many commercial projects, a game may take 2, 3, 5 years to actually finish completion. And because of that, we have these versions called LTS versions, long-term support versions. Now this isn't going to mean a whole lot to you guys because you're not professional game devs, but if you wanted to have a supported version of Unity that was always going to have patches and updates and so forth for years in the future to support your development, you would want a long-term support version of Unity. As far as we're concerned, we need the latest and greatest. We want the best features. We want all the cool, hot stuff. We would start with 2019.3. Now, if you really want to be on the bleeding edge, which you should not for the hackathon, or any other project that you need to make sure stuff is running, you can always grab the latest pre-release. It's always going to have the latest features in it, lots of things that you may want to use, but they may not work. They may cause your projects to not work. They may corrupt your older projects as well. Only go to pre-releases for new things, Don't try and keep up with pre-release versions of software for Unity. In fact, for your project, if Unity rolls out a new release of Unity during the course of your development, you probably don't want to upgrade to it. You want to stick with what you know works. If you want to try out new versions later, you can, but stick with the version that you start with, because there are bug fixes and patches and changes that may change behaviors that make your game break. Now, if you want to assume that we did want to install a different version of Unity, let's say we did want to install the pre-release, we could select it here and we will click Next. Now what you're going to get are the different modules for your install. Unity installs fairly light. It'll install the editor, but it's not going to install all of the different options that you might want for your particular project. So for example, there are dev tools inside of Unity. There is already an IDE for writing code and compiling code and so forth. Some developers like Visual Studio, so from here you can install Visual Studio Community Edition. There's also an equivalent on the Mac if you want to do that on the Mac as well. Now you also have the ability to install your different platforms. Here I have Android build support selected, so it would download and install what's necessary for Android support. If I wanted to handle iOS build support or tvOS, or build on the Linux platform or build for the Mac platform, etc., etc., all of that stuff you would just select it here. One thing you always want to make sure you have is the documentation selected. There are going to be lots of things that you're going to want to find the documentation for. Make sure you have the docs selected. If for whatever reason you don't see that you have build support for your platform selected, please select it, because otherwise you will be able to author in Unity, but you won't be able to actually build in Unity. After that, you click Done, and as you can see, Unity Hub in the background is going ahead and handling the download and install process of that particular version. Now once it finishes its install, you have something similar to this. So here I can see that I have a 2019.3 install. I can also see that that particular install has Android build support, and I also have the ability to do Windows builds from this particular version of Unity. I don't have to have that for every release. If I didn't want to do Android builds, I could have unselected that. If I didn't want to do builds for Windows, I could have unselected that as well and just used it as an editor. All of that stuff is really up to you, but this is where you manage all of that. When Unity is finally finished installing and importing all of the things necessary for your scene, you will be graced with this interface. This is the Unity interface. This is the new interface for 2019. If you guys have looked at older versions of Unity or used older versions of Unity, it looks very different. The behaviors are still the same, but they've gone with a different look and feel. It's more of a flat UI. If you've used Blender or tools similar to that, it's closer in look and feel to what Blender looks like. Now that we have it open, we can take a look at the different pieces of Unity and talk about what they do. Now Unity is broken up into different sections. So this section is the hierarchy. This is where you'll get layout for all of the things in your scene or in your project, things that are actually in the level that you're designing. Down at the bottom here, we have this project tab. So this is where you would manage all of your assets, your scenes, your sounds, all of the stuff that you want to bring in to your project, even if they're not in a particular scene in the hierarchy. This area is the scene view, so this is showing us what our world looks like. Right now it's very empty. It has a camera in it and it has a light in it, and that's pretty much it. And we will populate this shortly, but these are the things that are by default in our world. Sometimes you will delete these things because they don't matter for the scene that you're building, but those are the things that are in our world right now. Next up is the game view. So this is a real-time view of what your game looks like based on what you have in the scene. This other tab is the Asset Store. So the Asset Store is integrated into the Unity environment, and you can go in here and grab assets. You can look at the assets that you've already purchased or downloaded, and this is where you will find most of the stuff that you want to use for your projects. If for whatever reason you don't see the Asset Store, you can go into Window and you can see the Asset Store here. You bring up that tab. Next, we have the inspector over here. So similar to most tools of this type, the inspector will provide you all of the attributes for different things within Unity for whatever you have selected. So for example, if we select the camera, we see that all of the attributes for the camera are here. Now there are some other things that we're not really going to get into a lot. One is collab. Collab is very good for you guys that are going to be doing version control on your bigger projects. Probably not as relevant for you guys since you are literally sitting in the same room with each other. But when you are working on your larger projects and you're going to be separated from each other, collab is good for version control of assets and resources and code. It's a good environment for that. Then you have all of your various services. We're not going to be using any additional services here, but there are a variety of services for doing ads in your games and being able to do debugging and logging and so forth and so on. All of that stuff would show up here in services. And then under account, if you had a particular, I'm already logged in as me, but if you had a different account that you wanted to go to, you could go to that account. Now what's important here is upgrading to Unity Plus or Pro. If you're someone that has a license, this is how you would connect those things together. We're not going to be doing that here. We're going to continue to use this particular version. If you have a paid version that you're using for a hackathon, the proctor or TA will have given you whatever keys you need to make sure that you're using that. And the rest of these tools we'll talk about shortly as we start building out our Unity project. Another tool that you have at your disposal is going to be the console. The console is where you will get information about any errors or anything that Unity wants to let you know. That information will show up in the console. Now one thing you have the ability to do with these tabs is you can reorganize them however you like. So you can drag on the name of a particular tab and just move it to wherever you like, or you can detach it and leave it floating. Usually it's better to have it attached somewhere, but you can move them wherever you like. Some people like the console always at the bottom. Some people want to put project management and the hierarchy together and leave the scene view with more real estate and so forth and so on. If you've organized this in a particular way and you like it or don't like it, you can go into Window, Layouts. If you liked your layout, you can save it. You can give it a name. So I can say that this is Greg's layout, and I can save it. And now I am in Greg's layout. If it's something that you didn't like and you want to go back to a default layout, you can either click over here where the layouts are listed, or under Window Layouts and select the layout that you want to move to. Default is the one that Unity always starts with, so if you really like the default view after you've done your changes, you can switch right back to it. Use what works best for you. I tend to have a bunch of different layouts depending on what I'm doing, so from time to time you may see me shift my layout around. It's not required for you to do the same. Do whatever is comfortable for you. So the next thing that we want to go over are some of the core concepts and terminology that you might hear in Unity. I don't want to get too far ahead and start talking about certain things and you don't really know what they are yet. So we're going to go over some of the core concepts and terminology. We will readdress them as we cover these topics in detail, but just so that you understand what they are, I wanted to go ahead and start with those first. So the first thing that we really want to talk about is game objects. So everything in a scene is a game object, and a scene is kind of your stage. It's your level. It's where the player is going to be doing their stuff. Game objects are the stuff that's in your scene. Players may be game objects, they may consist of game objects, your guns are game objects, the trees are game objects, the ground is a game object. Typically, everything in a scene is a game object. So it's the base class for all of you programming types out there for most things in Unity. And what that means is everything is a game object. It inherits certain behaviors from other objects. Uh, so one of those is the transform. Everything has to be somewhere, and the transform is that somewhere in 3D space where it's going to be. So that's its position, which is its XYZ coordinates in space, its rotation, how it's positioned in space, and the scale, which is how it's sized in space. These objects can also have a tag, and you'll see this in the interface as we start making some changes to things. And tags basically allow us to find things faster. So a player will have a player tag. So if ever we're writing a script and we want to figure out which one is the player, we can just look for things that are tagged player. Similarly, things can have a layer. Now this is going to be very similar to Photoshop for you creative types that understand what Photoshop layers are. Things can exist on different layers. In the engine, we can segregate things out by layer. So think of it as clouds and birds. While they're both in the sky, clouds kind of have their own layer and the birds have their own layer. So the birds can move through the clouds and interact with them, but they don't necessarily have to collide with them. That's one of the tricks that we'll get into a little bit later. Now, static game objects are things that just don't change. And that allows the game engine to do some cheats for performance sake to make things perform a lot better, since it knows that they're not going to be manipulated in any way. Now, prefabs are game objects that you're using more than once. So let's say that you have the model for a car. When you create it and you put it in the scene, and then you put another one in the scene, and you put another one in the scene, that's cool. You have 3 game objects that are all cars, but let's say you wanted to change the color on all of them. Well, if they're all just models by themselves, they all have their own individual attributes. What a prefab does is it is a collection of all of the common attributes for all of your game objects so that you can manipulate them as a collection. Anything that you're using more than once should be a prefab, and we'll talk about that some more as we start doing things, because prefabs are fundamental to how we will be building the game. Components. Now, components are things that you attach to game objects to give them functionality or behavior. So a transform is a component. With lights, all of the lighting attributes are all components. With audio, if something is playing a sound, there's an audio component, and that audio component will have things like, here's the sound that I'm playing. Transforms, as we mentioned before, that is a fundamental for describing where you are. So it's in Unity we have a left-handed coordinate system, and world space is the global coordinate system for all of our for the universe of our game. And then we have local space, which is all relative to the game object's origin. Typically for our games, the things that you'll be doing, you'll probably be positioning everything in global space. Now when you start talking about putting say a gun in a player's hand or a fire hose or something like that, you're going to position that not in world space but in local space, because it's positioned relative to some point on the player. And as we talked about, position, rotation, and scale, those are fundamental things that you'll be able to manipulate in order to change the appearance or position of an object as it sits in a scene. Lighting. Lighting is powered by a very specific engine called Enlighten in Unity that provides it the ability to do very high performance lighting from a light source. We have the ability to do all sorts of different lights within Unity. Point lights, which are going to be kind of like the sun for all practical purposes, where it has intensity, but it's not really pointing in any particular direction. It's just kind of there, and it's illuminating everything equally. Directional lights, so it's illuminating everything, but in a particular direction. The direction that it's not pointing, the lights don't affect it. Spotlights, they affect everything not just in a particular direction, but within a particular lighting cone. And then we have area lights, which is for baked lights. So if you want to have a light that only affects things in a very finite area, that's what we use our area lights for. With respect to shadows, Unity will compute those itself. We don't have to worry about shadows. If there's a light source and an object, and we have Unity, we're telling Unity generate shadows, it'll just handle it on its own. Cameras. So cameras are how we see things in the scene. We'll typically only be dealing with perspective projection for our cameras, although you can do orthographic as well. Orthographic doesn't add any perspective correction, so everything appears to be the same size regardless of how far away from the camera it is. That's probably not going to work for most of our games. We're probably going to want perspective, but it's up to you. You may come up with some really creative idea for using orthographic projection. You can go into the camera and change that. Audio. Unity has a fairly sophisticated audio system. There are multiple ways of dealing with all of your 2D and 3D sounds, dealing with Doppler and roll-off, and how sound is attenuated based off of position from the user and the ear and so forth. All of those things are possible in Unity. We're not going to delve too much of that in the hackathon because we're going to be typically dealing with fairly simple sound sources, but you can do a ton of things with the audio engine in Unity as well. Physics, so that's all handled by NVIDIA's PhysX engine. And that's pretty much what everybody uses industry-wide. It is a hardware-accelerated physics engine. It's very, very good. It's based off of rigid bodies, joints, and colliders. We'll talk about a lot of that when we get to Section 5 and we start talking about physics and colliders and so forth. But all of that stuff is baked into Unity. We don't have to do anything special in order to get physics to work. Animation. Now, with animation, in our case, we're talking specifically about character animation, 2D, 3D animation. And Unity manages that with a finite state machine. So an object is in a particular state, which means it's playing a particular animation. If it moves into a different state, it should be playing a different animation. And you can have Unity blend between those two animations so that it looks seamless to the user when they're playing the game. Scripts, we'll be doing a lot of script using, not necessarily a lot of script writing. I'll be giving you guys a lot of scripts that are already baked. You'll be able to use those in your games, but know that all of our scripts are in C#. Unity is kind of phased out support for Unity Script, which was a JavaScript version of writing C#. So we'll be using some of the scripts from GameKit and some of the other tools that Unity provides in our game so that we don't have to really deal with a lot of code writing. You may be modifying some of the code, but you're not going to be starting from scratch and trying to figure out how to make some of these things work. Now that concludes everything for part 1. What you should have accomplished in this section is getting Unity Hub installed, making sure that you have a working version of Unity with the appropriate components to build for the project and environment that you're going to be using. You should understand some common terminology for Unity, such as game objects and transforms and so forth. But really what you want to do now is make sure that your version of Unity is working properly. Configure it however you'd like with respect to dragging specific views around if you'd like. But really your goal now is to make sure that it's all installed and working properly, because you want to make sure that's ready for the next sections. So let's take a break. During this break, make sure that it's all working, and if you need some help, be sure to reach out to someone to make sure that your install is ready to go.